Welcome to Impact Pasadena. It's my great pleasure to be interviewing today LA County Assessor Jeffrey Prang. Jeff, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. One of the things that's terrific about your appearance here is that a lot of people don't even know what the LA County Assessor does. But before we get into that, because we're going to talk about that plenty today, I know you have such an interesting background. You've done public service. You've been the mayor of West Hollywood.
That's right.
And the big question I ask you is, which is a harder job, being mayor of West Hollywood or being LA County Assessor?
So, LA County Assessor is it's a huge department with 1,500 employees and a very large budget. But when you're a mayor of a city, President Johnson said once, he said, sometimes when I think of the burdens of the presidency are just more than I can handle, he says, I think it could be worse. I could be a mayor.
That's right.
Because when you're the mayor, people think that a mayor is responsible for all things government, whether it be federal or state. Right. They corner you in the grocery store and talk to you about what's going on in their street or decisions are being made.
Garbage pickup.
Nobody knows what the assessor is. Yeah. Most people think I'm something that I'm not. And if and when you're walking through the grocery store, people don't know that's you. So it's
well, so tell us what the LA County Assessor does and what your responsibilities are and about your department.
So I always begin by telling people what I don't do.
Okay.
I do not collect taxes. Another guy with a very intuitive title collects taxes. He's called the tax collector. So the assessor's job is very simple. We're basically real estate appraisers. We're not a fiscal office. Our job is to assess the value of all taxable real property and business personal property in the LA County and to assemble what's called the annual assessment roll, which is the inventory of all taxable property, which is the foundation for property taxes. I tell my employees, and frankly anybody else who will listen, that in many ways my department is the most important local government agency, because the truth is no one else can do their job until I've done mine. That means if I'm only assessing 95% of the property that should be assessed, that additional 5% that we're missing represents millions of dollars that could be spent on public education, on parks, libraries, roads, and public safety and other services that we all rely upon. The primary job of the property tax system is to pay for those local services that we all depend on.
Well, and I know it's an impressive number that you're talking about for your department, because there's 2.6 million properties that you assess in your jurisdiction, and it represents $1.3 trillion in value, which sounds like a medium-sized country to me.
It is. LA County, I think if it were a country, it would be one of the top 10 largest economies in the world.
So, just to be clear, you assess both commercial and residential property? I know you talked about business personal property, but it's also business property, correct?
All property, commercial or residential, industrial, whatever, we assess that. We assess business property such as furniture, equipment, or machinery. Think like an MRI machine at a doctor's office. We also assess commercial aircraft at LAX and Burbank. We also assess general aviation aircraft and boats. We also assess something called possessory interest. This is public land being used by private entities, such as a boat slip at Marina Del Rey or a restaurant at LAX. And something I just discovered recently, we also assess racehorses.
Wow. So anything you can touch in LA County, you pretty much going to get assessed.
Pretty much, yes.
Yeah. How do you do it? So what's the drill?
So, as I indicated, we have about 1,400 employees, of which about half of them are real estate appraisers. And so they go into the field and they apply a number of techniques to quantify the value of property. And the way that we do that is twofold. One is when property changes hands, the registrar of recorders sends us copies of the new deeds, which become like a work order for us to go out and assess the value. Or if you are doing new construction, like adding a pool or a second story or an alternative dwelling unit, all cities are required to provide us with copies of building permits, which we then will look at to determine if that's an reassessable event.
So do your assessors work off an algorithm, or do they actually, I'm assuming they actually go out to some degree?
Yes. So there's three different methods of valuation that we apply. For residential homes, we look for comparable sales, something that's of a similar size, similar configuration that's sold recently. We also use something called the income approach. A hotel, we may look at its income, or an apartment building. More complicated properties, maybe like a stadium or a unique property, we'll use the cost approach, and sometimes we'll use more than one approach to apply to those valuations. And being a real estate appraiser is a highly skilled position. Takes years to learn that trade. Assessors across the state work collaboratively to establish standardization in how we approach those valuations.
Gee, I would imagine with something like a stadium, you'd have a lot of pressure from builders and people like that, and owners saying, oh, you're over assessing here, and we're talking millions of dollars. I'm
that
sure
never happens. So commercial industrial properties, unique properties in particular.
Yeah.
When we come up with a value, we call that an opinion of value, because it's not a precision approach. So property owners will almost always pay top dollar, then immediately argue for a lesser assessment when it comes to the valuation. Yeah. And so that's a process we go through rather rigorously. If you don't like the value that we place on the property, you have the right to appeal before the Assessment Appeals Board, and there are about 28,000 cases waiting to be heard before the Assessment Appeals Board of those who disagree with our value.
Now, the Southern California real estate market, as you know, is always up and down, big booms, big busts, bubbles, things like that. That must add an extra load to your difficult work. Is that right? So
it does, and for different reasons. We're actually right now in the 8th consecutive year of growth since the recession of 2008 to 2010. But in a declining market, the workload goes up as well, because if your property loses value and it's worth less than what you paid for it, we have to reassess it to the lower value, and then we have to analyze it every year. And sometimes, like in the 2008 recession, we lowered about 550,000 properties' value that were worth less than what people had paid for them. Yeah. And because we use mass appraisal techniques, which are not necessarily precision estimates, allow those folks appeal them. So our appeals go up, and the appeals take a lot of time to process as well. So what I can tell you right now in the economy, that we're seeing that homes are sitting on the market for a longer period of time. Right. Values are still going up, but at a much slower rate. And this is not just a LA issue, this is a national issue. So the increase in interest rates is probably one factor.
So that would impact the revenues to the state to spend on all the things that they spend money on, education and things like that. I mean, I imagine that if you're in a hot market, there's a lot of turnover, and that would increase the revenues to the state or to the county.
So that's actually a good question. Just to step aside for a second, people want to know where their property tax dollars go. Yeah. Roughly a quarter, roughly 40% of every dollar goes into public schools. About 25% of every dollar goes to the county for sheriff and courts, et cetera, depending on which city you live in, because cities have differential property tax entitlements. Might be as low as 4% to as high as 25%. Special districts, like water districts, get a piece of the action, and so do the former redevelopment agencies. And that's where, so your property tax dollars are really local dollars.
Okay. And depending, it could be as high as 25%.
In some cities. Yeah. So there were a lot of cities that incorporated in the late 1950s that they call them low or no property tax cities, because they opted out of property taxes when they incorporated. Not sure what the rationale was for that, but they're regretting it now.
One of the things that swept this state in the last year or so are these terrible disasters, the wildfires and other things, and that would, I imagine, impact property values, particularly for the poor homeowners who've lost or had damages. And what role does the assessor play in all that?
We play a big role. So the general rule of Prop 13 is the stabilization of your assessment.
Prop 13 being
Prop 13 is the governing constitutional amendment. It's called Article 13 of the Constitution. Right. And under Prop 13, it essentially says that you will pay taxes based on your purchase price, or the market value at the time of your purchase price, or the market value whichever is lower. So if your property is destroyed by fire, it's clearly worth less money than it was at the time that you bought it. So we will reassess the property to reflect the damage from a fire, earthquake, or flood, or other natural disaster, and you will get temporary property tax relief until you've rebuilt the property.
So do you have a rough guesstimate how many people have been impacted here in this?
In LA County, I apologize, I don't have that number
Right.
in front of me, but I think it's somewhere between 1,000, 2,000 properties. You know, Malibu was particularly impacted.
Yeah.
A good number of properties in that city is going to have
So
a huge
you'll go
impact.
in as a matter of course and reassess whether or not there's actual people who apply for it, or
So we will do it either upon an application or proactively. So in the case of the Malibu fire, we're working closely with the LA County Fire Department to determine which areas were impacted by the fire, which properties were affected, and anybody within that burn area is going to be getting property tax relief automatically. But you can also apply individually, what we call a decline in value, or in the case of fires, a misfortune and calamity application. And those that we do automatically may result in appeals because, again, it's a mass appraisal technique, and individual properties will be impacted differentially.
Well, I know for the bulk of people who are watching this, and for most of our citizens, the homeowners are impacted. You know, the average person who has property taxes, which were, by the way, due yesterday. And
April 10th.
Yeah, it'll be a week before the show airs. Well, what happens, by the way, if I'm delinquent on my taxes? Do I come in and say the cat ate my homework? I can't.
Don't. The advice I would give to you and anyone else is do not be late on your property taxes. So the first thing, if you are late on your property taxes and you're unhappy, don't call me. I don't do property taxes.
Yeah.
That's the tax collector. But they all eventually do. And we refer them to the tax collector's office. But the tax collector is severely constrained under state law. The excuses that people will say is that they didn't get their bill, or that they moved, dog ate it, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
But the tax collector is not allowed to accept any of those explanations. I always joke, I say the only explanation you could come up with is if you could demonstrate that you were in a coma for 30 days before the bill was due. But one of the things I learned is that your tax bill is really considered a courtesy notice. The state says, state law says you are obligated to pay your taxes whether you get a notice or not. And you're obligated, as part of your responsibility of homeownership, to know when tax day is due. And so they will not accept those excuses.
So
it's a 10% penalty. So if you bought your home in the last couple of years, that's a pretty big chunk of money.
You know, for homeowners who, you know, nobody likes taxes, but we pay them because they provide the services that we need as a society. But there are a lot of special programs that the assessor's office offers to help people who are in special situations, perhaps, lighten the burden a bit. Could you talk about some of those? Because I know you have a number of them.
Sure. The most important one is the homeowners exemption. So everybody who owns their home and uses it as their primary residence automatically qualifies for the homeowners exemption. And it will lower your assessed value by $7,000 for property tax purposes, which is about $70 a year in savings. Not a big savings, but it's free money in perpetuity as long as you own the property.
And you only have to apply once for this.
That's right. Excuse me.
Yeah.
And we estimate that about a third of LA County homeowners do not apply for the homeowners exemption. That's about $30 million left on the table. We also have programs for veterans, for seniors, the disabled, and for nonprofits.
Well, I also understand that you have a transfer, which I thought was very interesting. So if I own a home and I want to transfer it, or I die, and I want to transfer it to my child or my grandchild, that the assessment will remain stable. Is that correct?
That's correct. So it's called the parent-to-child exclusion.
Okay.
You can give your property to your children and not have it reassessed. The purpose was that is to keep the family home in the family after the parents move or pass on.
Right.
In some cases, you could also give it to your grandchildren, although it basically means your children have to be dead.
Okay.
But it could be a big savings. Other programs for seniors, if you are a senior and you've owned your property for a long time and you want to move and downsize, you could take your low value with you to your new home. And you could also move outside the county into one of 11 participating counties in California.
Okay. Well, let me ask you questions on a couple of hot button issues in the news. I know that there is talk on, maybe there are actually proposals statewide on Prop 13 that would make some changes and adjustments to that rule, which has been in effect since the 80s, I believe, or earlier.
1978.
78, yeah. You know, we're fortunate, I think, in some ways with Prop 13. A lot of the East Coast states don't have this kind of stabilization, but on the other hand, it puts a pinch in local spending for important things like.
Right.
So what's happening?
So, Prop 13 does provide the benefit of stabilizing your property taxes. So it kind of tells you what that burden's going to be through the life of owning your home. The flip side is it does create some inequity. So if you bought your home in 1980, you're paying a lot less in property taxes than somebody who moved next door last year to access the same sort of services.
Or our children who want to live in Pasadena, and
Right.
Of course the property values are very high anyway, but I know my son just bought a house and his property taxes are probably 3 times of what mine were in the 1980s.
So what's been proposed is a measure called split assessment roll, or split roll, and it's been qualified for the ballot in November of 2020. And if this is enacted, what it will do is it will continue, allow us to continue assessing residential properties as we have been since Prop 13 was enacted, but it will require that assessors reassess commercial and industrial properties either annually or on a cyclical basis. So the belief is that by the advocates is that because commercial and industrial properties don't change hands with the same frequency as residential properties, and because they have a lot of ownership vehicles that allow them to avoid reassessment, that they are no longer paying their fair share. And there's a good example of this legal, what we call legal entity ownership, which allows them to evade reassessment. There was a hotel in Santa Monica called the Fairmont. And when it was sold a few years ago, its Prop 13 base year value was, I think, around $80 million. But its market value was closer to $250 million. But the people who wanted to buy it didn't want to see a tripling of the property taxes. So they put together a limited liability corporation amongst the family where they all owned minority shares. And under the current law, a majority of ownership has to change before it can be reassessed. And even though 100% control of the hotel changed, 50% ownership didn't change. So it was not considered to be reassessable. And I think most people would argue that Prop 13 was intended to stabilize property taxes, not to create loopholes to evade them. And that sort of legal entity ownership opportunity really doesn't exist for homeowners. It's really exclusively for commercial
How do you police
industrials.
something like that?
It's very, very difficult. Well,
Yeah.
one, in the case like this, one of my predecessors did actually sue, and they lost on appeal. But that is a pointed law that I think reasonable people could argue should be changed. That Prop 13 should not provide opportunities to evade reassessment.
Well, and for the average homeowner, it could really stir the emotions because you think, gee, somebody's getting away with an extra $200 million or so in assessment, and I'm paying my fair share.
There is a cost. I mean, we all, we all pay into property taxes to pay for services that we rely on. Yeah. And if somebody's getting a special deal, I think it offends people's sense of fairness. If it is passed, it will be a very difficult measure for me to implement because we don't assess property that way. That's actually what they're actually proposing with a split roll is a return to pre-Prop 13 assessment practice, which is the way most states do it. But our whole system has been geared for 40 years to do it differently. So I would have, I have 1,400 employees. We estimate I would need to hire an additional 500. My budget is $180 million. We estimate that I'll need $130 million in my first year. So the logistics of implementing this additional $130 million with an ongoing $80 million increase going into the future. And so it would be very difficult for me to implement this if it's passed within, I don't think I could do it in less than 5 or 10 years.
Do you have a sense of what additional revenues this would bring?
Well, there's a lot of estimates. One estimate from the advocates is that it will generate anywhere between $9 and $15 billion in revenue. I think that may be optimistic because I don't know that revenue estimate contemplates what will happen in the economy should this pass. And let me give you an example. So I'm a former council member in West Hollywood. We had the Sunset Strip in our city, and there's this liquor store that's been there for decades called Gil Turner's, kind of famous. They've had a very favorable lease for decades. But it's a triple net lease, which means that they pay part of the property taxes. So if they had to suddenly pay rent based on a 2020 assessment as opposed to the 1975 assessment they have right now, their operating costs will increase dramatically. And I think this could have a profoundly negative impact on small businesses. So there will be, so it's not, and even if you're a big business, because property taxes will now be a large variable number, it may have an impact on the overall growth of property values. Because you'll need to make decisions on buying property that account for the flexibility of property taxes, because right now that's a fixed number.
It's interesting how sometimes best intentions are more complicated than all that.
Well, there may be ways, but I think the most important thing I can do to advise policymakers and the public is what our interpretation of how the market will be impacted and what the logistics will be if it's adopted.
Along those lines, does the rent control movement that's coming along have an impact at all on your assessment work, or is that a different ball of wax?
It could, yes. So if rent control has an impact on property values, it won't affect current values. I don't think a jurisdiction implementing rent control is going to result in declining values. I mean, it could, but I don't think so. Values are going up in LA County, not down, and they may impact the growth of values over time. They may grow slower than they would without it.
The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, I guess it's called, just came out this week with some projections about the global economic growth. And although the United States is doing really well, there's kind of a global slowdown beginning to happen. And whether or not it rises to the level of the 2008 recession or not is a question, but we are looking at a slowdown over time. How is that going to impact property values and also what we're all concerned about is revenues to the county and the state in terms of property taxes?
There's a lot of my colleagues in the assessor world believe that there is a recession on the horizon, and it could be due to a number of things. Once we are seeing a slowdown in the growth of property values, although that we could attribute that to the increasing interest rates. But then there's other things that I'm frankly kind of surprised they haven't had a bigger impact yet. One is the impact of the tariffs. Another one we'll probably see more after income tax day on the 15th, that this will be the first year that property owners in California and other big states like New York are going to feel the impact of the loss of a lot of deductions and other advantages that they had.
Which could negatively impact property values, right?
Yes, it could.
Yeah.
In my sense, though, is in California, is that I don't necessarily see property values as going down, but I do see a big depression in terms of their growth. And a failure in property values to grow means reduction in revenues for local government.
And also, I would imagine that the rate of the sales pace impacts, because when somebody sells a house, then it reassesses probably way up, especially if it's been there for 30 years.
So about a year ago at this time, there were some homes in some neighborhoods of LA County where there were bidding wars for property. We're not seeing that anymore, and properties are sitting on the market for a lot longer, and they're taking less than their asking price. Values are still going up, but at a much slower speed.
One of the things that people talk about, and I'm not sure that there's that much validity to it, but certainly the high cost of housing and the tax levels in California are a topic of discussion. This is really not in your area of responsibility, but do you have a view about this, the housing crisis, and how we're going to confront this in California?
Well, I think my view is more instructed by my time as a city council member, and I think we all recognize that there is a housing crisis, an affordability crisis in particular, and we know what the answer is. But the challenges that we have in responding has other consequences that people are frustrated with. In LA County, traffic, density, parking, all these issues are creating negative impacts on the quality of life to living here. In many ways, the answer is still creating more density and more mass transit to make make mobility and more affordable housing in places where people want to live.
Of course, you get the NIMBY pushback on all that too. I imagine in the Prop 13 instance, if that does change, that there'll be some disincentive for construction. I mean, in the scenario that you suggest, is that possible?
It's possible, but most of the challenges there are within the purview of city councils, and some cities are a little bit more willing to confront NIMBYism and to allow more growth. Other cities have put the yellow tape around their city and say no more. And I don't. I'm glad not to have to be in that hornet's nest anymore.
You know, I read an interesting article that you had discovered in the basement of the county offices some historic journals, and I didn't want you to leave without telling us about that interesting story.
So this was the coolest thing. Plus, I'm really into. I'm a history buff, and I'm interested in these sort of things. So we have an old library in the assessor's office, but most of our materials are now online. So we were disposing of things we didn't need anymore and putting other things in the storage. But I discovered that there were these daily journals. And I thought it was maybe the secretary for the former assessor who kept a day journal. But it was a senior appraiser in the office who worked there from the mid-20s till 1951. He kept a daily journal. And it wasn't just his work journal, but he did put in things like the cost of chickens, because they used to assess livestock. But he also put in things from his daily life. He put in his Rose Bowl tickets from the Rose Bowl game he attended. He put in newspaper clippings. He had clippings from the day that the Pearl Harbor was bombed. Put in a wedding he may have gone to. It was really whatever was happening in his particular life. And he did this like 25 volumes. And I thought,
25.
Right. Wow. And it was a day in the life of he was a guy named David Cathcart from Pasadena, and it just gave you the perspective from an everyman's daily perspective on life in LA County for 20 years. So
what did you do with these? What's going on?
I thought there was historic value to them. So I contacted the Natural History Museum and asked them if they had any suggestions. And they said, yes, we do. We want them. So I donated them to the Natural History Museum. They have added them to what's called the Seaver Collection, which is a collection which really talks about a lot of the history of Los Angeles. And I think that in the future, if people just really want to get a perspective on
you know, it's interesting because historians going back to the Middle Ages have found these kind of diaries from normal folks, let's call them, or people who are in the tax business. And this is kind of the most extensive record of what daily life is like. You know, how many, Thomas Jefferson, what were his crops like? What were, is all the things that he did on a daily basis.
History usually tells us the big seminal events that everybody knew about, but this is the daily life of an average person, and what they were seeing and what they were feeling at that time, and I think it's really important.
Yeah, well, that's great. Thank you for finding those, and thank you for all the fine work that you do, and for telling us about what it is you do, because I think it's a mystery to a lot of people. So, LA County Assessor Jeffrey Prang, thanks so much for being my guest on Impact Pasadena.
Thank you so much. It was great
I really appreciate it.
I really enjoyed it.
Take care. Take care, Jeff.